Welcome, everybody. This is from Evolve 24, and I want to welcome you to our GeoInnovation Speaker Series. This is the fourth event in the series, and this time we're very excited to discuss with Will Cadell, who's the CEO and founder of Sparkgeo. We'll be talking about the intersection of geospatial across a variety of different industries and the impact it's having. As a quick reminder, the GeoInnovation National Speaker Series is a collaboration between Innovation Hub's Cortex and T-Rex, as well as GeoFutures, which is an initiative of the recently formed Regional Economic Development Organization, Greater St. Louis, Inc. That was launched in October 2019. Its purpose is to bolster the St. Louis region's rapidly growing geospatial sector and develop a strategic plan for our future growth. As mentioned, we're very delighted today to have our host or member from Sparkgeo, Will Cadell, who's the founder and CEO. And he's a geospatial partner for some of the biggest brands in technology. His academic background is in engineering and remote sensing. And Will has worked with government science, municipal engineering, resource and technology centers, turning data into great value. Since starting Sparkgeo, Will and his team have been helping startups, large enterprise, as well as nonprofits across North America make the most of location through the strategic application of geospatial technology. Will, we're delighted to have you as our guest today on the GeoInnovation Speaker Series.
Great to be here, Tony. Thanks very much for having me.
Will, why don't you tell us a little bit about Sparkgeo and its incredible success and impact it's had?
Sure. We're still, I would say, a very small company in comparison to a lot of the big beasts in the geospatial sector these days. But yeah, I started Sparkgeo about 10 years ago, 2010, 11 years ago, I guess, to put maps on the internet. I came out of the Canadian resource sector, and it seemed like geospatial was kind of stuck at that point. I felt there was a bit of a sort of downturn in the forestry sector. And I thought, you know what, this is a great time to start thinking about where my industry is going and what more can be done. And you start looking around, you start looking at the trends, you start looking at some of those signals, and you realize, wow, we should really be thinking a lot harder about using the web for geo. And things evolve from there. And largely, we're doing the same thing now as what I started doing back then, which is putting maps or geospatial on the internet, or at least using the internet as kind of this key kind of complementary asset to the geospatial evolution that we're rolling through here. So yeah, we're now a bigger team doing much the same stuff, writing a lot of custom code, doing a lot of custom data science work, but also studying our industry really hard to figure out where we should be pointing ourselves and where we should be advising other people to point in regards to geospatial technology in the next few years.
Well, what a significant need as this industry begins to flourish and grow. And Will, I know we have a video that you brought with you to give us just a wonderful overview of Sparkgeo and some of the areas you focus in. BJ, if you would be so kind to run that video for us.
Look up. Consider there are hundreds of Earth observation satellites in low orbit. Every week, more are launched. We have sensors collecting data everywhere on Earth every day, both in the sky and on the Earth's surface. This results in a vast amount of data. We hear lots about cryptocurrency, artificial intelligence, and quantum computing, and these represent tremendous opportunity. What staggers me, though, is what we're not talking about. Geospatial is changing everything, and almost no one realizes how colossal the opportunity is. I suspect that within 3 to 5 years, there'll already be winners and losers. Losers will move too slowly, they'll be overtaken. Others will stumble along, bleeding cash and opportunity. They'll build internal geospatial teams and inadvertently starve them of oxygen. I'm convinced that the winners will build alliances. They'll collaborate to move fast through complex terrain. Geospatial is wickedly complex, and it's moving blisteringly fast. Winners will seek the world's top geospatial talent and team up for what might be a bumpy ride. Companies that harness geospatial technology will gain a critical advantage. They'll be working with more and better data. They'll be made aware of the risks and opportunities, and they'll see emerging patterns before all their competitors do. Geospatial data isn't just coming from the sky either. When you're routed past construction spotted by another driver, geospatial is getting you to work faster. When your bank looks at transaction histories of others in similar areas, geospatial is getting you the credit that you need. When your insurance company sees that your flood risk is low due to topography, geospatial saves you money and helps the insurance company reduce their risk. These are examples of geospatial analytics providing user value and real business value. Sparkgeo is a geospatial consultancy. Through our reputation and involvement in the geospatial community, we managed to attract brilliant people. We grouped these geospatial experts into teams that are ready to hit the ground running. These teams are gelled, experienced, and battle-tested. Industry partners then tap these teams to gain strategic advantage. We offer sector exclusivity, so we're fully committed to each client's needs and goals. In some respects, we are more like a management consultancy than a traditional GIS company. We offer advice and capacity on geospatial research and development, cloud-native software architecture, and data science. We have worked with some of the biggest brands in technology. Our teams solve pervasive industry problems. We also release open source code to prove it. We maintain sector-exclusive relationships with companies in imagery, big agriculture, and the environment. At this time, we look to expand into insurance, transportation, and banking, and we seek forward-thinking leaders in these areas who want to collaborate and are willing to make bold moves. I'm Sparkgeo's founder, Will Cadell. I look forward to speaking with you about how your company might use geospatial technology to move forward. Reach me at will@sparkgeo.com.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that and bringing that with you today. What a powerful, fantastic video overview of the value of location science. It's really tremendous. You know, I'm curious, with such great value, as you've indicated, of where it can apply, and you've worked with so many high-end tech companies, what do you see that your clients and customers see as the value that location sciences brings to their organizations?
That's a great question, Tony. Just allow me to get over hearing my own voice in videos. I kind of hate that. I think a lot of people do. Anyway, what the value the value of geospatial varies tremendously in different verticals. But understanding, and this is kind of one of our like organizational theories, is that there's a strong notion of landscape change and human activity, and where those things meet, there's kind of deep value. So whether it's understanding how people are moving, or whether it's understanding how our landscapes and our, whether it be built or natural landscapes are changing, the intersection of those things is, and the measurements, and then the subsequent understanding of those things is the central value proposition provided by our industry. And I think that's the piece to keep on coming back to. And so how do we understand that value, and how do we distribute knowledge of that value to our broader communities, whether it be the insurance sector, whether it be the retail sector, whether it be consumer goods, all these things, all of them can understand geography within their own environments, but they might not need a map, or they might not need something that we are super familiar with creating. They might want something disseminated in a different way. And I think that's a really important piece for us to remember. Often we get stuck on, oh, you should use a map because it's a better way of understanding this data. Well, that's cool, except that might be the biggest barrier to the adoption of geospatial. How about we just provide them with data in a manner that they understand first, and then we can come back to this mapping environment, which indeed might become a great visualization tool, but not necessarily the be all and end all.
Will, you hit on some tremendous points there. Having had the fortune of founding my own company, Evolve24, that's a data science and predictive analytics company, one of the things that founded many years ago, one of the things was always the embracing and the adoption of these capabilities as they were new very much in 2004 and 5. And I'm really interested for your perspective, Will, on where you're seeing which sectors are experiencing the embracing and growth among the various industries that you work within. And I've already started to somewhat harness this geospatial technology and information for great value.
So I would say that one of the earliest adopters was the big ag space, or agriculture in general, digital agriculture, we could call it. So it's, you know, the climate and the Monsanto sort of colliding in that acquisition and subsequently colliding up into Bayer. I think those guys really thought deeply about geospatial because it's so intrinsic to their value. You know, understanding change on landscapes within a constrained temporal environment is intrinsic to providing better advice as regards seeds, better advice as regards the management of different agricultural practices. So I think that's big ag, obvious user, has been a tremendous advocate for geospatial in general. I think another big leading light, there's a couple of really interesting places that we should all be sort of paying close attention to. Automated vehicles, or vehicles in general, maybe not just automated. I mean, you know, automated vehicles, flying cars, that's just a little bit away. But understanding sort of vehicular movement, I think, is really interesting. And I think it used to be the concern of like startups in San Francisco who understood how to map San Francisco really well. But I think now we're seeing efforts emerge in regards to, I see GM doing it. We see Toyota's got their AMP product. Larger automotive companies are thinking about maps. And that's really interesting because they think about maps in wildly different ways from how we used to think about maps when I studied sort of remote sensing and GIS, like in the early 2000s. We're not thinking about maps that are living creatures that are consuming data from different places and morphing on a daily basis to a new reality, which is the existence that we live in. So the map being alive, I think, is fascinating. And there's so many interesting geospatial problems just in that notion in itself. And the fact that it used to be a startup concern, and now it's like a major automotive concern, means that we're not just mapping San Francisco anymore. We've got to be able to do this and roll this out kind of globally. So that's an astonishing problem to solve. And I would say that the interesting place that startups should be thinking about, I think, is the finance sector. And I say that because I can't count how many Earth observation startups there are launching new constellations of sensors, whether it be active sensors, passive sensors, whether it be RF, whatever it is. There's a gazillion satellites in the sky capturing data of various different forms. And that data flow is simply not being captured by a sector which is very data centric. There's a gap between massive data flow from pixels and the consumption of that data flow by these sort of data centric organizations in the finance sector. This kind of pixel to alternative data gap, I think that's an astonishingly valuable place for new geospatial companies to be operating. So like so many places that we should be thinking about, and we should be building new and interesting products around. I think that's where I would be spending my time as a geospatial strategist. Anyway, that's what we should be looking at.
That's fantastic, Will. I think from one perspective, you talked about an industry that's really in companies like Monsanto and Climate Corp nearby who've done tremendous work in the area of digital ag and furthering knowledge there and leveraging location sciences. And then you talk about other industries having opportunities. And in fact, one of the things that really caught my attention in the video was the mentioning of the insurance industry and your citation that there's being quite a bit of white space for geospatial in the insurance business. Basically, how do you see currently insurance companies and organizations specific to that one you mentioned with white space using the data or not using it, and thoughts around what opportunities there are in the future?
Yeah, I think there's tremendous opportunity in insurance. Wow, like is there a sector right now that is more motivated to understand the effects of climate change than the insurance sector? I doubt it, frankly. It's like it must be hitting the bottom line of various organizations pretty darn hard, and understanding that and accounting for it, or at least measuring that change, which is overtly something that the geospatial community can do. That's like literally what we should be doing. That seems like a big opportunity. Now, there's some really good leading lights. I'd point out Arturo.ai. They're doing a lot of great work around sort of how it's building-based insurance from remotely sensed sources. I think that's really interesting. They just recently raised a 25 million fund. So that tells us that there is interest in the community. What they are doing is filling in that gap I talked about between pixels and value. And the endpoint is basically an API call that goes to various insurers. And the beginning point is a series of pixels that come out of the sky, whether it be airborne or satellite-based sensors. So they're providing that sort of translation layer between pixels and insight to an organization, an insurance-based organization that would traditionally have used other means, but they can do it like that based off understanding landscapes. That is a great model to sort of take and just apply in other industries. I think that's exactly what geospatial can do, I think.
That's fantastic. I love the concept of taking that understanding and applying it and connecting it to it. The insurance, you bring up climate change, and one of the things, there's both concerns around the use of data as well as great promise and opportunity as to its potential. And I'm curious, maybe first starting with the concerns around potential data privacy and it as a potential barrier for widespread acceptance and societal acceptance and adoption. Seems to come up a great amount in any of the large big data conversations. There's a lot of data you mentioned that's being collected that lays out geospatially coordinates and location of different entities, including individuals. This data could be used in a variety of different ways, but what are some of your thoughts and opinions how we need to carefully navigate the usage so that we foster societal acceptance of these techniques and tools to benefit society?
Yeah, I would argue that technology has moved faster than policy in the last 20 years, and perhaps that's not a great thing. So I think the technology sector has been more motivated by, oh, we can do this, as opposed to, oh, we should do that. Mm-hmm. And I think those are things that we need to struggle with. And I think that the fact that we're now mature enough to ask those questions and not just rush into things and sort of, I think this notion of moving fast and breaking things was great. I think maybe we can be a little bit more circumspect now. There are those who would argue that any sort of location-based data is inherently private by its nature. Certainly if it's coming off, I don't know, like a cell phone or something, then it's hard to abstract the individual from the data because it's sitting in your pocket and it's tracking you wherever you go. That is definitely problematic. Although I think at an aggregated level, there are ways of anonymizing people within a crowd. I'd point to Matt Box's movement product, which is like anonymized on the device. It's kind of interesting. That's the first time I've seen that approach taken. And I think that's, although it loses some of its initial value to those people who want to sell you ads, it gains value in being useful in more general situations where there are sensitivities around privacy, which there should be. So I think that's a really interesting evolution in how we deal with this kind of cell phone-based traffic data. So I can now know that there's a bunch of stuff happening at a location. I just don't know who's doing that stuff. And frankly, I don't want to know. I just want to know that there's people there, because if there's people there, then maybe it's good for my retail operation. Maybe it's good for my ride sharing operation. Maybe it's good for all that stuff. And it removes any of the privacy concern. So that's, I think it's demonstrable of like an evolution in how we are treating people and how we are treating their privacy to make it more of an opt-in operation than an opt-out operation. When we get to Earth observation, I think that becomes interesting too. Like the nature of the Earth observation is it's kind of pervasive and it's everywhere. Like I would still argue that if you want to do something nefarious, you just do it at night or you do it on a cloudy day in the most part. Obviously active sensors aside, but there are still questions, I think, to be understood around the privacy and around Earth observation. I remember when I was young, I know a long time ago, there used to be this concern in Europe around common agricultural policy and the eye in the sky, which would be measuring farmers' fields, which is exactly what we're doing now in terms of big ag and the management of big ag. And now it used to be thought of as, oh, we shouldn't do that because we're effectively looking into the bank of a farmer. But actually, there's tremendous value in that data, as we know, from a broader sort of management perspective. And I think now that community is very much on board with using those technologies to better manage their resources. So there is a discussion and there is a status quo, and sometimes we need to have that pendulum swing back and forth a little bit to find a sort of common ground in the middle.
Those are excellent insights on the different areas. You know, it gives me thought, as you said, about the different applications and how you could use it. You've done some tremendous writing with your firm at Sparkgeo about the product trap and this race. Why don't you share with our audience ourselves, because I think it's such a great framework of how to think of things. Tell us about the product trap.
Yeah, the great thing about writing is that you don't have to hear your own voice, which is nice. So the product trap's interesting because, I've got to a place in my career where people come and ask me about ideas. It's like, oh, we've got this thing. What do you think about this? What do you think about that? What do you think about this? And which is great because, like, basically my job has become talking to my friends about geospatial all the time, which is I couldn't ask for a better job, frankly. So people are asking me questions. And so often in geospatial, we get this use case discussion, like, can you tell me use cases for this? And can you tell me use cases for that? And I scratch my head and I think, how on earth have you got to this place and you're asking me about how to use this thing? Like, how does it happen that you've already got X million dollars in your startup and you haven't figured out how to use your technology? That's crazy. Surely you should have the problem and then you should seek the answer. And so this notion of a product trap is really interesting because you need to hold these sort of like Fitzgerald's two opposing ideas in your head at the same time. One idea is that there are a bazillion opportunities in geospatial. And I liken it to, in Scotland, you go to a sweetie shop and you'd have all these different ideas and but the problem is you only really get to choose one. So you can have all these things, but you can only choose one thing to do, because if you try and do more than one thing as an entrepreneur, you fail almost instantly. Like maybe you can get away with 2 or 3 things, but almost always on a geospatial product slide, you get the slide that says, we are in every single vertical in every single industry and we can do all the things. But the problem is that almost every like geospatial environment is limited by sales and marketing and by engineering. So you actually can't do all the things. All you can really do at any one time is one thing, because your salespeople need to understand and walk in the shoes of your clients. Your engineers need to sort of understand their problems super deeply and all these things. So you have this kind of opposing forces, which is, oh, I really want to I really want to solve all these problems, and I can work in all these verticals, and I never want to say no to anybody. And then at the same time, you kind of have to say no, and no is literally the most powerful word for an entrepreneur, I think. And it's a word that gives you focus, and a word that gives you sort of a place to sort of rest your hat, if you like. But without saying no, you're in this place where you say yes to everybody, and all you ever do is add little features to a product without ever getting to a point where you focus enough on the product that you could get it to take off. And that's the trap. The trap is, look at all these things that we could do, and we should do them all. And as soon as you think that, you've fallen in the trap. All you should do is choose one. Because the other way to think about the opportunity is that there are enormous numbers of problems to solve. And you should fall in love with the problem as opposed to falling in love with the technology. Falling in love with the problem means that you can adopt different technologies to solve the problem. And the problem is probably still geographic. You just might one day be choosing an optical sensor. The next day you might say, well, you know what? Turns out we can't do this thing with all this cloud. We need to change up our product and do it based off an active sensor. And that's cool. That's a better approach than just being focused on the technology. So yeah, we do use technology, and we should be proud of that, but we should use the appropriate technology to solve the problem. Don't fall into the trap of just providing the value through the technology 100% of the time, and be willing to change up the delivery of your value to suit the particular problem that you're trying to solve. Does that make sense? It's kind of a convoluted answer.
Makes tremendous sense. I think you've done a nice job articulating for all of us. There's the fact that you can be an expert, but also what you articulated is the learnings you've had as a founder as to how you commercialize your capabilities. And those founding principles of a startup is to get very focused on the problem one is solving, and to leverage all the capabilities you may have at your disposal to solving that problem specifically, versus technology for the sake of technology. I think your product trap write-up on your website is tremendous for those who are participating today. If you wanted to learn more about it, there's a wonderful write-up that Will has put on the website talking about it. And I think it's great, both from a geospatial and from a startup framework that one would greatly value. You know, Will, you brought up the concept of use cases, and where you can apply it in use cases and problems one might solve. And, we've got a question that just came in, which really very much aligns to the question and thought I had, which was innovative use. And the question we got was, what would you consider the most interesting technology or innovation recently created that can propel the next transformation of the geospatial industry? And I do want to let, as others know, that if you do have any questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A. I'll be also having a few other areas I'd like to explore with Will. So feel free to put those questions in the question and answer field. So Will, what would you consider the most interesting technology innovation recently created that has the potential to propel that next transformation for geospatial?
I think it's really interesting. So I think some of the biggest changes that have happened for geospatial recently have actually been what you might call complementary assets to the industry. So I would say that the cloud has opened numerous doors for the geospatial sector. It's enabled the wide adoption of geospatial. It's enabled this notion of big data, which allows us to do some crazy stuff with much larger data sets than we were able to do before. So I think the cloud is pivotal. I think smartphones and the broader use of GPS by individuals on a day-to-day basis has turned location into an everyday activity. It used to be the purview of professionals. Now it's in 2.5 billion people's pockets. That's an astonishing change within the last 15 years. That wasn't there 15 years ago. But now we have 3.5 billion people with smartphones in their pockets. The commercialization of space has enabled all this Earth observation stuff. So those are three kind of what I would say are overtly non-geospatial complementary assets, which have allowed us to build new things overtly. And I think that's really fascinating. So I think the next stage that we should be paying attention to as a community, like my phone has LiDAR on it. Like, I know, you know, it's funny. Back in the day, I had a Nokia phone, and I remember thinking to myself, why on earth would I put a camera on a phone? That seems stupid. I've got a camera, it's way better than my phone camera. And now, and obviously that's a ridiculous concept now, because the cameras that we have on our phones are amazing, and it's super useful because the best picture you take is the one that like the best camera you have is the one that you always have with you. So if you have it, it's a great idea. So I think about cameras on phones. I think about GPS on phone. GPS on phone took about 10 years to be fully pervasive. LiDAR on a phone, I would argue, is probably going to be general within literally 2 years. So if we have LiDAR on every phone, does that mean that our typical cartographic view switches from looking down to looking up? And it's telling us information. It's like an augmented reality kind of a thing. So is our cartographic experience going to change? And I think that's a really interesting thing to consider, because I think there will be a lot of opportunity in there. I think augmented reality is going to become, it's going to sort of leave science fiction. I mean, it's not been science. I mean, it's been pretty robust for a long time, but it's going to become much more consumer based on the fact that we have sensors looking forward at all times. Also sensors on vehicles doing the same thing. So I think this whole notion of the typical cartographic view is going to change. I think everything is going to become 3D by default. You know, again, Mapbox has gone 3D by default. Cesium has been doing a great job of 3D for some time. So like, I think our notion of cartographic visualization has a third dimension now, and I think that'll be an expectation. So lots of really interesting changes, but look hard at the complementary assets, I would say. Look hard at the things happening around us, because I think a lot of them are enabling geospatial in general.
Well, Will, you bring up, as you described it, especially with LiDAR, you've coined this concept and spoken about it of the mirror world. And you have a beautiful video on that your company's made available about touching and seeing in different ways the geospatial and location elements of everything we interact with on a day-to-day basis. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So in no uncertain terms, the concept is not ours. Geospatial mirror, or the digital mirror world, was talked about in the late 90s. I forget the name of the professor. I apologize for that, but it's referenced in our blog post. But what we found is that we're really, so as a community, we're really good at selling geospatial to each other. Geospatial people are really good at talking about geospatial things to other geospatial people. But we're not really very good at telling our stories outside our own communities. And we wanted to start building these kind of mental and visual linkages between what it is that we do on a day-to-day basis and everyday stuff. So those people who are outside our echo chambers can start understanding what it is we do on a day-to-day basis. So the digital mirror world is really just a way of thinking about geography and thinking about what we would call digital geography, and a way of visualizing it around us. And it's kind of neat if you start thinking about it, because we work in these kind of geographic data sets, in effect, the data is around us. And if you start thinking that through, you think about all the things that you're sort of touching and interacting with as you walk through either a built or a natural landscape, all these things are to some extent digitized in some manner. And we're making connections between this physical reality and this digital reality all the time. And we have these portals, we have computers, and we have phones, which allow us to interact with these digital environments. And they are worlds that sort of exist inside computing environments. So I think we wanted to paint this picture to help those of us who are not necessarily geospatially oriented or super in the geospatial community to understand the value of geo, knowing that the big markets for geospatial people are markets that we are yet to fully exploit and explore. So we need to start talking to people who don't know what we do to build those markets. And we need to do that in a manner that they understand. So how about we use fewer acronyms and instead we paint more pictures? Because I think that helps this kind of notion of understanding. So that's what we've tried to do, stay away from acronyms and start using words that people understand. Whether and it's great because we start doing this stuff and it feels all like science fiction-y. And we start telling these science fiction-y stories, but actually none of them are made up. All this stuff is real. All this data is existing. It's out there. We just paint it with little green lines, which make it look like Tron, and help people understand what we're trying to do. But all this stuff is actually happening. We're just presenting it in a way that makes it look spacey and exciting. But it is. We are living in this kind of science fiction experience, which it's a really exciting place to live. That's why I think we can provide a lot of value to other markets, which are at this point kind of nascent, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that brings up, Will, from your experience in advising and consulting leading organizations, as you mentioned, the different opportunities and advantages and power that could be generated by harnessing geospatial data, providing some significant competitive advantages, both to existing companies or new companies. But what are some of the challenges and gaps you've seen as companies try to embrace these capabilities where they're seeking to leverage its value, but have some significant challenges? And what are some of those you've seen and possibly even helped some of your clients remove as an impediment to taking advantage of this incredible source of capability?
Yeah, there's a couple of pieces in there. I think as a society, as a community, geospatial has a tendency to overpromise, which is problematic. I also think that it's important for us to remember that there's a massive data quality issue within our industry, or maybe it's not an issue, maybe it's just a reality. So in most, and I think it's also like a nature of our expectations around geography. So 80-20 rule is relatively accepted in most locations and satisfactory to most people, except when you go and navigate somewhere. I am not happy about only getting 80% of my journey complete and then being told 20% is wrong and being left somewhere. Like 20%, that's not getting me to my location. So 80-20 rule doesn't apply to geography. However, I would argue that a lot of geographic data is pretty ropey. So at the best, we're getting to this place as less than perfect, shall we say. So we as a community need to provide tools around the pragmatic use of geospatial data and be constantly vigilant about providing better data all the time. 80-20 is not good enough for navigation. It's not good enough for mapping. We need to be doing a better job of data quality in general terms. Geospatial data, like I think any data source is kind of somewhat opinionated, i.e. it is the opinion of the creator that kind of morphs that data set. So we need to be cognizant of removing bias from data sources, and that's a problem. I think maybe that links a little bit back to our privacy stuff, but there is definitely bias intrinsic in data as regards how it was captured, even if it was captured in kind of an automated manner. So that's something to be cognizant of. And just the sheer quantity of geospatial data is something to be cognizant of. Like cell phone data there's a lot of cell phones out there. So if you think about the number of geographic data points being created every single day by 3.5 billion phones on Earth, you think, wow, that must be a lot of S3 buckets, frankly, that are being filled with location data of some form of varying qualities, telling different stories about different parts of the world and different parts of people's lives, whether it be serious and, like SOS calls, or whether it be super frivolous kind of Pokemon Go stuff. So location data being stored somewhere on the cloud in some way, being used by different people. So the biggest barriers, I would say, are parsing the quality to quantity ratio of data itself. I think that's an astonishingly difficult thing to do, and it comes down to understanding the sensitivities around every single sort of data and sort of business intelligence product that we subsequently want to derive from that data source.
That's a really good overview and framework of some of the challenges. While it has so many potential challenges, and we talked about different elements, location sciences can obviously be an incredible instrument for societal good. And I'm really, given your broad experiences advising different firms with this tremendous potential that location sciences has, curious if you can tell us your thoughts of an area you feel it's greatly benefited and been utilized to benefit society, or areas you'd like to see location sciences utilized to benefit society in different manners.
I think so. I think nonprofits are dealing with some of the biggest problems in geospatial, and I think that they are dealing with some global challenges, and I think that's where geospatial is providing tremendous value. So whether it be Wildlife Conservation Society doing their mermaid projects like coral reef protection, whether it's WWF doing sort of other wildlife conservation efforts, or whether it be kind of local stuff or global stuff, nonprofits have enormous problems to solve, and a lot of them are deeply geospatial and super interesting. So I think that's a great place for looking at the impact of digital geography on the betterment for mankind. I would also argue that geospatial is going to be pivotal in the measurement and subsequent management of climate change. I think I can't imagine that geospatial is not going to be deeply involved in those discussions, whether it be like GHGSat measuring methane output from places, or whether it be looking at forestry changes, or whether it be looking at sea level rise or freshwater access, that kind of stuff. It's all greatly measurable by the geospatial community. And I think a lot of those questions haven't yet been properly addressed with what we would call like dominant designs or anything. I don't think we know what those products look like. In the same way, we don't know what they look like in the finance sector. We don't know what they're going to look like in sort of the climate change management sector, but undoubtedly those products will probably look very similar. So what I think is really interesting is that we're at this kind of this stage of ferment where we have these complementary assets which have emerged to give us the ability to do things. We have the geographic knowledge which can leverage those assets to do the thing, and we have the overt need, societal and business needs, to understand those things, but we haven't yet built the appropriate products which allow us to do this in a holistic, highly scalable manner. And there will be a bazillion different sort of parts of that spectrum as well. I think there's going to be a lot of very exciting geospatial activity to happen over the next decade. I mean, right now we're in this brilliant place of ferment where if you have a good idea, you can run with it, and there will be people who are very interested in seeing if that idea has legs or not. it's a great time to be in the business, I would say.
Well, it brings up two areas that we've got questions from our audience on. And let's start with the first one. You mentioned it's a great time, great opportunity. And not only are you the CEO of Sparkgeo, you're also the founder. So you created it from the beginning. And so as a new startup, one of the questions we have is, as a new startup in the industry, what resources might you point some of our audiences to, specific for the geospatial sector, and potentially even funding resources that you found very key and helpful in your journey as a founder of a company?
So I'm up in the frozen wastes of Canada. So some of the stuff available to me is different from some of the stuff available to others. But I do know that Arts Grants in St. Louis is definitely a good source of funding. I think locally to the St. Louis environment, going down to GeoSource TRX to go and just talk through opportunities is great. I'm a big fan of Slack. We set up a Slack channel, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years ago. Geospatial community Slack channel, great place to go for chat. We're not administrators on it anymore. I just happen to get the occasional admin ping on it now. But it's run by its own community. It's, I think, 3,500 geospatial people strong. So a really good community of people to bounce good ideas off. But in general terms, I would argue that the investment community is highly motivated to add geospatial to their portfolio. So doing your research and finding early stage funds or wherever you fit in that model. I know the US government is very motivated to find innovative geospatial technologies for various different parts of their sort of governance elements, whether it be military or whether it be, again, climate change. So I think there's funding in that regard too. But I would also say it's probably the cheapest time ever to start a tech business. There's no expectations of offices. There's no expectations of anything. You can sign up for AWS for free, and you can use virtually no resources to do R&D. So I think now is a great time to be testing out concepts and to be bouncing around ideas. So I would have said, if you're a geospatial person, track down, figure out your problem area, figure out a domain expert, sit down beside them virtually or in person, depending on the status of pandemics, and have a virtual beer and figure out what you can solve together. And I think that's a magic kind of combo. Find a hedge trader, sit down with them, show them some geospatial data, get excited, build a business. Find an insurance person, show them some geospatial data, put your heads together, start a business. That kind of stuff, that's exactly what needs to happen. And in that regard, you pick up the domain expertise, you have the technical expertise, you're off to the races. That's basically how I would think you should start these days. That's
terrific advice, Will. I couldn't agree more. Having founded Evolve 24, there's just so many opportunities from a time and technology that allow new startup entities to break through in very significant fashions, resources that are available. And for those of you who had similar questions, obviously the sponsors of presenting this GeoInnovation Speaker Series, T-Rex with its strong emphasis in geospatial, Cortex providing innovation cluster, and GeoFutures, areas of need, areas of focus. These are 3 entities in addition to the insights that we'll provide that you can seek out to gain support in these areas for starting an initiative to solve some problems. And you talked about, Will, some of the different use cases and applications, and we talked about how some of them bridge very closely on an intersection of society and business and government. I'd really welcome your perspective in this in regards to how do you believe public and private partnerships can play a better role to leverage geospatial? And this is a question from our audience as well. So how can public-private partnerships play a better role leveraging geospatial?
Well, the thing about government is, and you know, I'm going to temper this with the fact that we're not very good at doing government stuff. The thing about government is they can bring the problem to the table that needs to be solved. Often they can also bring the data. Sometimes the gap in government is the ability, willingness, structure to, you know, to collide the problem with the data in a meaningful way. Now, data's, like, as discussed already, data can be problematic in terms of privacy, anonymization. So you have to be sensitive around this. But the great thing about doing things with government is that the sensitivity is built in. And I would argue that there is a big opportunity to do like startup weekend kind of stuff inside government environments where you get to try and solve problems quickly and identify, at least identify initial solutions or initial approaches to particular problems. I think that's a great idea. I think there's an opportunity for governments and private sectors to figure out some kind of partnership arrangement. I would argue that you need some kind of partner to curate those experiences, whether it be T-Rex or equivalent kind of partner to say, hey, these are the industry people, and hey, these are, they're not industry people, these are the government people, and these are the technologists who are interested. Let's get into potentially a non-disclosure environment where everyone feels comfortable sharing ideas, potentially some other kind of environment that they're willing to innovate around particular concepts. The notion of innovation I find a little bit problematic because kind of enforced innovation, I don't know. I think it can happen, but I think there's something missing in this kind of enforced innovation idea, whereby you have X amount of time and go be creative. And I think I get that, but sometimes the creativity just needs to come with exposure to a problem and then with exposure to other situations. So I'm in two minds about the notion of creating innovative environments. However, I am very pro the notion of colliding ideas. And I think that's really important there. So get people who understand the state of the art and get people who understand their problem set and get them to talk. I think that's a great situation for like what we would call crossing chasms and such.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the tenets that I've always felt is innovation occurs at the cross section of disciplines. And I really like how you've captured it, Will, is by bringing together, but not in a forced fashion, the ability to cross different disciplines, knowledge centers will allow for breakthroughs in innovation and innovative ideas to occur. Extremely well placed and framework. For those in our audience, in following up to opportunities to support startups, you might want to follow along in the chat, but let me just bring to bear that Capital Innovators in the region is currently accepting applications until May 14th, and they specialize in an NGA. They have a specialized NGA accelerator that is currently in session, and you could look for capitalinnovators.com to get more information. Another wonderful resource is the Missouri Small Business Development Center, also great for resource for tech startups. And you can find an email placed in the chat group that you can reach out to for more support and insights. Great. Well, Will, as we have a few remaining questions, one of the things I wanted to ask before we, with our remaining time, and that is, you've had so many wonderful engagements with clients, made so many different initiatives and projects that you've worked on across the different communities and technologies and different companies. And, I'm really curious to know from all of the different ones you've had the pleasure of collaborating with, what's your proudest client success where you've taken an organization and advised them and in some manner really navigated them to be able with your very talented team, and you have an incredible team of experts that help with the navigation through the different stage gates and hurdles for a breakthrough. And with so many of them, I'm really curious as to, for yourself or your team, one of the proudest client successes that you've had on your journey as a company.
Yeah, we've done a lot of interesting things. Some of the stuff that I would say were most well, so some of the stuff, like obviously we can't talk about a ton of things because hey ho, services company. Right. We did some super fun work with Mammoth Lakes in California in the Sierras. That was amazing work. Like one of the first things I kind of ever did as a freelancer. That was super fun. But like for me, it's not necessarily about the stories and that kind of stuff or the things that we can point at. It's more about the long duration partnerships, which show a level of trust getting built between two organizations. And so often business is described as being acrimonious and people win and people lose. And it's like, well, actually, that's not my experience at all. My experience is it's this notion of value and creation of value for others. So if someone has a need and you can supply that need, and then you can do that continually over a long period of time, then two entities can grow very effectively together. And I think that's really interesting. So I think getting away from this sort of acrimonious competitive notion of business, and sure, there's notions of competitive advantage, blah, 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 blah. But this notion of competition in terms of a zero-sum game is kind of ludicrous. Certainly in the purview of where we are now with geospatial, where literally there are too many ideas and too many cool things to do, and like there's like a handful of companies I would say are similar to Sparkgeo, and none of us are competitive, and we're all talking to each other all the time, going, do you have time? Can you help me with this? We're super busy. We need some help with this. Can you do this? And it's actually more of a how do you work together situation. And oh my word, how do we all hire more people? Because there's so much stuff to do kind of question than it is anything else. So I like the stuff I'm most proud of is more around these long-term, what might be like slightly less exciting and less whiz bang, but more sort of deep, powerful relationships where one organization can just continually provide enormous value to another organization. I think that's what I would recommend to anybody else in a similar situation is don't think about short-term profit. Think about long-term relationships and everything. When you start thinking in a longer-term view, everything starts to fall into place. And the conversations that you have today might come to reality in 2 or 3 years, and that's cool. If you have the long-term view, that's a cool situation to be in. But you still need to have those conversations to have that reality. So be talking to people, but be building value. Don't necessarily be thinking about like profit.
Will, no, I can tell why you've been so successful. It's been such a pleasure to have you and for you to spend time with our community and share your insights and your vision and your thoughts around geospatial. We greatly appreciate it. Everyone, you can find more on Will and his company, Sparkgeo, on the website. But you can also, if you have parts of the conversation you've missed, this has been recorded onto YouTube, and you can revisit and see any elements. Will, thank you again. It's been a great pleasure. And for the rest of the audience, I'd like to remind you of the next session of this National Speaker Series. It's going to be hosted by T-Rex, Cortex, and GeoFutures. And we're thrilled and delighted to have as our next speaker, Vice Admiral Sharp, Dr. Stacy Dixon, and have it moderated by the former director of NGA, Robert Cardillo. And it will be held on Wednesday, June 2nd at 2 p.m. Central. Again, thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you at our next session.
Thanks so much, Tony.
Thank you, Will.